Hi everyone, good evening and welcome to the last of our 4 panel discussions based on themes which Madam Butterfly provokes, and also themes which are pertinent to us in the opera profession today as we grapple with the way to make our art form speak to today, to our society today. That is Welsh National Opera's mission. And tonight's panel is called Women Who's Telling Our Stories. We all know that opera has a habit of making the lot of the female characters rather sorry. It's something, it's a topic which I think is pertinent to the way we look at opera today, and to discover, are there ways we can reimagine that narrative, rather following on what we discussed at the second panel discussion. So it's my huge pleasure to welcome Jude Kelly to lead our discussion. Jude is, of course, known to everyone from her amazing directing career, but now, what, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, became the founder and director of the WOW Foundation. We're so grateful, Jude, that you've taken time out to come and lead this discussion. I can't think of anyone more in working in the arts who's more qualified to guide our panel. So, Jude, I'll hand over to you. I'll go off camera, and you can obviously introduce our wonderful guests.
Okay, thanks, Aidan, and thanks to Welsh National Opera for being so forward-thinking in the way that they are constructing these conversations. Yes, so I'm going to introduce my guests in a minute, but I'm just going to introduce me because it's all very well saying, oh, we all know Jude Kelly, but we may not. And so I wanted to say that, my background is a theatre director, and I've directed a small amount of opera in my time. I'm from Liverpool, so I'm a northern woman. And I have always been incredibly interested in how women are portrayed, how people are portrayed generally, how minority voices get, more caricatured, generally speaking, if they're visible at all. And in the years that I've been trying to think about how the arts can matter to everybody, and how everybody's imagination is required to make up the whole of the world that we aspire to have, that if those voices are missing or misconstrued or distorted, then you have no way of building a better world, because you haven't got the right evidence and you haven't got the right access points for people. So with regard to opera, although I haven't done that much of it, I remember very early on thinking, how could it be that Don Giovanni, a predator and a rapist, is one of the most sort of popular operas, and that nearly always the kind of way that it goes is, as so many anti-heroes are, that he's the star of the show, and that the women really are there, as in so many other pieces of our canon, not just opera. The women are really there to sort of build his plot and build his character flaws, but their own pain and their own agony and their own desperation is really not given central stage. And that, even Lucia de Lammermoor, with those wonderful arias, that I think that was probably the thing that drew me into opera the most, actually, that Joan Sutherland and her singing of those pieces, that the kind of idea that she was sort of driven mad, couldn't cope, and then, ends up really a bit like Ophelia, just wandering around the stage in a state of utter distress. But that's the way it goes with women, isn't it? And then they end up dead. It was always very frustrating to me to feel that there were very few female characters in opera or in theatre generally that had real agency and were really going to stand up and make change happen. They always seemed to be convenient victims. And as a blonde woman, I mean, the number of times I felt so angry at being portrayed as somebody who would be in a nightie being chased through a wood by somebody with a knife, or obviously it could be a supernatural thing with teeth, but essentially you were there to be murdered so that somebody could then start an investigation. And so the whole kind of idea of never really feeling as if you owned the story was something which I did a TED talk about a few years ago. And only recently have I felt that we are on the verge of centering women in a way that is respectful and invigorating and interesting. And there's lots and lots of initiatives that have made that possible, some political, some traumatic, but it does feel as if we are able to open up this inquiry as to what we do about a canon of work that, generally speaking, has women in supporting roles and not necessarily good ones, versus an idea that women's stories need to be told as human stories that matter to the whole world and not just to women. I've got three fantastic women to join me in this conversation. And they've all, in different ways, contributed to this idea of retelling stories, reforming stories, and reinvigorating also audiences' joy in an idea that it's not just for women, this stuff, it's actually for everyone. So Lindy Hume is currently directing WNO's production of Madame Butterfly, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. She's worked all over the world as an opera director, and she is, she's obviously one of the leading opera directors in Australia, but she's run festivals, she's run opera companies, and I think she's currently now artistic director of the Four Winds Easter Festival in Bumagui, I think that's how you pronounce it, and currently artistic director of the 10 Days on Island Festival in Tasmania. She was given the member of the Order of Australia for significant services to the performing arts, particularly in opera, in 2021. We've also got Clegg, who's a stage director and a choreographer. Again, I could list all her productions. I'm not going to. I'll rely on you going to your internet and looking at them. But one of the things that she has done so significantly is work with all women casts. And the production that perhaps maybe people might be very familiar with is Rhonda Rips It Up, great title, which celebrated the life of Margaret Haig Thomas, Viscountess Rhonda, who championed the Welsh suffrage movement. And we'll talk about that shortly. And then Lucy Brydon, who is a writer and a filmmaker. And she particularly is known for writing and directing Body of Water, which looks at a generational relationship of three female members of a family and the impact of anorexia on that family, which we'll come back to. But she's very interested, as we all are, in initiatives that allow different kinds of relationships between women and non-binary people to be centered, as opposed to be, also rans. So let's start with you, Lindy, if we can, and this particular production of Madame Butterfly. You've approached it in a different way. I don't know whether this is the first time you've directed Madame Butterfly, yes, but yes. Tell it, it's the first time. Okay, so what are these things which, you have to have a new idea about it anyway as a director. You've got to kind of have it in your soul to make a good piece of work. What is it that you suddenly found in this that made you think, yeah, this is urgent and I can do this and I want to?
Well, look, I think the thing that interested me when I was asked to do the production, there were a couple of things. One was that rather dauntingly, it was replacing a very famous and very good production by Joachim Herz, which was made some nearly 40 years ago, its purpose was its function as a production was to kind of really focus on the sort of American imperialism aspect of Madame Butterfly, and the brief was to do something quite different, obviously, and something that reflected the world in which we live. And it seemed to me that the world in which we live is quite an extraordinary place, for lots and lots of reasons. And it seemed to me that there were obviously implicit problems in the sort of Japanese setting of Madame Butterfly, but to me, the one that's screamingly obvious is the the bigger problem, the bigger ethical problem of how you deal with an opera, which is effectively a musical version of trauma porn, really. It is a 15-year-old girl being completely manipulated by forces that she doesn't understand, and failed again and again and again when she's put red flags up all the way through the opera. She's talking about death and talking about dying and talking about rather being dead than alive, and nobody helps her. And so it seemed to me that in this world that we're in now, what we need is empathy. What we need is to empathize with these characters and to sort of look at them through the prism of, what if the theatre is a great place for what if this was a real 15-year-old girl? What if this situation was happening now? And guess what? It does. It happens all around the world. Women are in some kind of in slavery or in imprisonment in some way. They are manipulated. This girl was only 15 when she's married in this arranged marriage, and by 18 she's a depressed single mother. And she's in a situation she can't understand and can't get out of, and no wonder she is mentally fragile. So that seemed to me the big problem, and it seemed very much at odds with the way that Madame Butterfly is normally perceived, as this sort of tragic, the opera tragic heroine, or the kind of exotic other. And I just I wondered if we couldn't find some more empathy in this time around, because it seemed to me that that's what the piece needs. I mean, it needs a whole lot of other things, it's a show where ultimately we're all in the world of show business and theatre and storytelling. So we needed to create a compelling thesis for this production, and something that meets the beauty and sort of ravishing, almost voyeuristic kinkiness, if you like, of Puccini's opera. It has to deliver, but I wanted to look at and see if there was a way of looking at it differently this time around. And what's the point otherwise, And
I mean, did it take you into controversial areas from the point of view of any of the cast? Because often people come at these pieces and they've done them several times before. And so it's like, well, sometimes people come, I'm not suggesting this is your cast, but sometimes people say, well, this is how I do my Madame Butterfly, or this is how I like my, this is how I view the opera. And obviously the conductor sometimes has their own view as well. In fact, very often does. So how have you had to negotiate people looking at this piece with fresh eyes?
Yes, of course. I mean, obviously, it's an incredibly loved piece of opera, and particularly with the audiences. I think that's the big thing, is that there's a lot of love for the piece and its sentimentality. It's all of the kind of Japanese, visuals that people associate with Madame Butterfly, the cherry blossoms and so forth. But what I have to say is that I have the great privilege and pleasure of working with Joyce El-Khoury on this production. She has never sung Madame Butterfly before, and she has, and also Alexia Bulgaridou, who a great Greek soprano who has sung it many times before, and both of those women have been extraordinarily open to doing this in this way, and to testing the ideas in different ways, and both of them have said to me, and I think we share these things in the rehearsal room, that they have found things in the piece that they, and others have said this too, not just the women, they've found things in this piece by looking at it through this different lens that they didn't know were so important. I guess one of the, it's not all the terrible things that happen to Butterfly and how much she suffers, but there are great joys, as we all know, in female friendships, and the female friendship story is something that's come up very strongly in both Butterfly, with a friendship between Butterfly and Suzuki, which is very solid and very almost a big love story in a way. And the same that I found in my last production of The Marriage of Figaro between Susanna and the Countess. And that to me is a real find.
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I was directing Othello, Desdemona and Emilia have the same sort of relationship where the older woman has this great sadness because it's almost like she knows that the younger woman is at the mercy of all of these misogynist forces, and all she can do is basically hold her in the space and hope that she'll survive, probably knowing she's not going to. I wanted to ask you about Puccini, because one of the things that I think is interesting sometimes is, artists of all kinds are often much more radical than they are thought to be once they're dead. And people often then kind of close them back into the status quo of the society, whereas sometimes they have been in the forefront of like addressing ideas. And I don't know enough about Puccini, but obviously nearly all of his operas focus around, Man and Lescaut, Mimi, Tosca. I mean, they all have these tremendous roles for women. And they're all, and I mean, Tosca in particular, is very clearly about how Tosca is compromised utterly by misogyny, by patriarchy, etc. So do you think that Puccini wanted us to feel that this is unjust, this is colonialism, as well as, child marriage, and that actually we in the audience should be desperately concerned and do something about it?
Yeah, I think there are some real hints in there. I mean, it's not how the pieces are, I guess, traditionally perceived, but it's not like it's not in the libretto that people, he does say, I mean, the original version of Butterfly, which is the version that the Joachim Herz production did, Pinkerton was much more racist than he is in this version. He's overtly racist. He's cruel to the servants. He makes fun of their names, and there's a lot more really offensive kind of stuff that's quite hard to listen to. And also there's a very important line in Butterfly when she says, I'm 15 years old, I'm already old. And there's a lot of chatter behind her in her wedding with all of her relatives saying, she's getting old, she'll be on the scrap heap in a minute. And Sharpless, the American consul, says that's the age for playing games, and Pinkerton says it's the time, just the time to get married, and that that goes within a second, but it's there. It's not. We know it's bad. We know it's a dodgy area because Puccini has made it clear that it is.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and we'll come to this perhaps with you, Lucy, but you often feel when you're directing a piece that if it's not in the text somewhere, it's really hard to wrestle a piece into a different political position. You can try, but it's very interesting how it springs back to speak of the things that it wanted to. And that's why I think that some of these great pieces have got a kind of moral knowledge in them, but it is up to us to find them out and make sure that we're not just creating pieces of reassurance. Oh, hooray, it's Madame Butterfly again, that'll be a nice evening. So I think it's like the re-radicalizing or the revival of the radical artist who's dead and can't speak for themselves is maybe part of this journey as well, and that can be men as well as women's. I started the WOW Women of the World Festival, which Aidan referred to. I was obviously the artistic director of the South Bank, and I was, in a very senior position as a woman in the arts. It didn't mean, though, that I wasn't presiding over stories and concerts and evenings that were, by and large, nearly all male composers, male writers, male rock stars, etc., etc. I mean, it was an overwhelmingly problematic thing for me that women's voices were still so absent. And that because of the lack of mainstreaming and the lack of training over hundreds of years as well, that you were still always putting women in and there's also some women's stuff. And I really felt as if one of the things I had to do was challenge this whole idea that women's stuff isn't the center of human creativity, because I felt as if we have been told, and we can internalize the idea that men are divinely creative, as the Michelangelo picture suggests. Men artists are divinely creative, and that women can be creative, but they're mainly there to talk about women. And that therefore, unless women's stories are central, women's human rights aren't central, because they're not seen to be human. And in fact, it wasn't until Hillary Clinton actually went to the Beijing summit 25 years ago and actually said women's rights are human rights, that women's rights were put into the idea of the Human Rights Declaration, which was created in 1948. So, I just say that for the audience, because it isn't a given that women have got rights. And, if you go to a lot of these societies, and Japan is still one, all women's rights are conditional based on really the sort of idea of how the society chooses to see itself. And if it returns ever, as in Afghanistan, to its theological principles, then it's returning always to scriptures and theologies that basically say women are not equal. And so, there's a much wider story and fight that we still have to carry on, even though it's a great thing that we're able to kind of thrust these stories back into the center at the moment, in the way that you're doing, Lindy. Caroline, you I know have done a whole range of pieces of work centering women, but I'd like you to talk particularly about the impact that you feel you had when you kind of worked with all-female teams, or all-female creative teams, because it used to go unnoticed that all teams were male. It was just, as in, it often goes unnoticed that men are doing things generally because isn't that just normal? That's just the norm. And so whenever there were more than like 3 women, people used to say, oh my God, there's an awful lot of women around, aren't there? And an all-female team has often been perceived as something which is like in itself a political statement, almost like a hostile statement, anti-male employment, or, we don't need you guys, we're going to do it on our own, all of which is, I think, nonsense. However, when you do make the decision to have an all-female team as an artistic exploration of the aesthetic and also of the spirit, can you tell us what happened in your case?
Well, I think joy erupted is what happened. We had direct conversations very early on. It was very liberating, really. We were talking about a woman's story. It was Lady Rhonda, Margaret Haig. She was a radical of her time. She was a business leader. She was the chair of 52 businesses. She had a lesbian relationship, but she was also married very young. But the story was, although it was, 50, 100 years old, it was very modern as a story as well. And so the conversations that we had in rehearsals were about real people, singers, creating the characterization of a real person, but there was no game playing. There was no ego. It was just very open, very frank, and a lot of fun, because there wasn't this sort of, I think, gender game playing. And one thing that was really revealing is when the women were playing the male characters, dressed in male costumes. It really revealed deeper layers, really, of the woman's humanity and the resilience that some of the women who'd been put into prison and force-fed for, women trying to get the vote. So it was a great revealer of that, really, for the audience particularly. And there's lots of humor in it, but I think that was one of the main things that came out of it, but that we could have really direct conversations, and rehearsals moved very quickly, working together collaboratively on scenes. I knew what I wanted from a scene, and then we would just work it out very collaboratively, whereas when I've worked in a male-female cast, I haven't found that ease of directing and that ease of creativity quite so quickly.
Do you know why? Why would you say that? Why?
Why? I think it was the female story was front and center, but also I think because maybe it was a new piece, but that because there wasn't this ego or this sort of vying for position, everybody seemed, there was a real equality in the rehearsal room.
I think this is an interesting territory, not just to do with the arts, but I have a boy and a girl children, and then I have a boy and a girl grandchildren, and boys are still told that they need to sort of demonstrate their chutzpah. They need to kind of show that they matter. So, I think boys are put under an enormous amount of pressure very early on to sort of be competitive. It's part of being able to demonstrate you're a proper little boy to be competitive. And obviously, that kind of role modeling of all of that, it's very, very entrenched very quickly. And so, in a rehearsal room, I think there is from men, and this is not a criticism of the male species, but a criticism of the way that we've gendered our societies. I think that, men feel as if they somehow don't count unless they've made their voice heard. And sometimes making their voice heard is a tremendous waste of time. But, it's a sort of way of spraying the area with their wee, if they were a cat. It's like, yes. I'm here, please notice me, and I'm here. Yeah. And also that thing of being devil's advocate, which is very irritating, because you don't really need somebody to be a devil's advocate. They could just tell you what they think. They don't need to tell you what they don't think. But a lot of that goes on, whereas I think that obviously, the downside of being a woman is that you've been told to be nice and kind and quiet and polite and collaborative, which sometimes, doesn't work in your favor in some contexts. But when you're women together, that is very, very powerful, very, very positive.
Yeah.
And so would you do it again? And would you do it again regardless of whether it was a female subject matter that you were examining?
Absolutely, because I think what was front and center was the story, and egos didn't matter. It was telling the story in the best way we could, and that was, like you were saying, there was no competition to achieve, someone had a larger role. It didn't matter. The story was paramount, and how that came across to audiences, because audiences were very balanced, male and female, but we had community involvement as well. So it embraced the wider community as well, coming into the rehearsal room, and we fed off each other because it was a communal story. But I would absolutely do it again. Yeah, with regardless of, the gender-led storyline.
And since you and I are both Northern, yeah. I'm interested in this idea of Northern stereotyping is just irritating, full stop.
Yeah.
But I did a radio program recently, well, not very recently, but where I was asked to do a kind of a radio program about the battle axe, the female battle axe. And I sort of tried to unpick that kind of idea that, that strong women are called battle axes, although I think that's something being applied to me at times as well. So, where are you on this idea of finding a way of recalibrating the regional idea about women? By the way, I'm just going to turn the light on because I look like I'm being lit by an opera. So keep going.
Well, I think I spent 12 years in London, and I was a performer before I went into directing. But I remember having a dreadful time when I first went to London, and excuse me for saying this, but I was called a dirty northerner to my face. And why don't I get back up north? And I'm from a farming background as well. So I think it's a difficult question, because I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. But I'm heartened by this generation coming through now, leaving Brydon College and graduating, because they are really calling out this issue of, particularly I've had it about accent. I tried to change my accent. I can change it. I was an actor, but I'm now sort of proud of that regional voice. But it doesn't have to be a regional storyline. But yeah, I've been, I would say, slightly bullied for being a northern strong woman as well. And particularly, dare I say, in opera, because it is, there are great variety of female directors, but there is still a north-south divide in our sector.
There
definitely.
is, and I think we've just got to name all this stuff. Incidentally, audience online, please put questions into the Q&A box, because I will be taking questions. So if you've got questions, type them in. I'm sorry we can't take them from you in person. But that thing about like naming stuff, because there is a circle, isn't there, which is that people whose voices are less welcome are shamed into feeling that they're not as relevant, and that actually it's rather ridiculous, and they'll be humiliated if they speak up. But you know, I think the kind of legitimacy issue in art is a real problem, because we give legitimacy to white European male educated, but educated as in sort of noted to be educated in particular contexts, and all of that is graded, and you can experience it. You know, you could absolutely experience it, and so even though the arts suggests that it is a place of truth-telling in its own institutional ways, it actually is just as intersectionally oppressive as anywhere else. And in fact, the Black Lives Matter has blown the lid off some of the ideas that the arts was able to speak on behalf of everybody, because of course you can't speak on behalf of everybody if everybody that's doing the speaking is white, or if everybody who has the power is a man, etc., or if everybody is you know, cisgendered and thinks they can speak on behalf of all women. So I think that it's a really critical time for politics to cross over with, you know, all issues of representation within the arts. And I don't care whether people then want to kind of label that as woke. I hate the phrase, and I think there's a very deliberate and pernicious desire to ridicule again. In the 80s, it was called political correctness. Now, people hated political correctness. I mean, some people did, but nevertheless, the result of that political correctness is, of course, we do not stand up anymore and make racist jokes and sexist jokes, and you know, we don't do the things that was common parlance in the 70s and early 80s, and everybody knows that that's not okay. But we're now into a next phase of this, where, you know, everything has been included. Yes, we have gay marriage, etc. We can have all sorts of things, but somehow society is kind of go, okay, that's enough now. That's as far as we're going to go for a while. And so that's why some of this pushback, I think, is very, very disturbing. And I'm interested, Lucy, if I can come to you, because you're in your mid-30s. And so I think it's fair to say that, you know, you didn't probably go through the period that I went through. Well, I know you didn't, where all doors get flung open and you think, oh, here we go. This is it. It's equality. Yeah. It's come. And then you know, the political climate changes, as it did in the 80s, and all of a sudden we've got Section 28. You've got, you know, you can't talk about sexuality in schools. This women's lib stuff has gone all too far, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Political companies need to have their grants withdrawn. I mean, all that happened in the 80s, and so you're kind of clawing your way back to this place where we yet again say whose voices count and whose voices matter. So I'm keen to hear how positive you're feeling about a kind of territory that's been unlocked again, and also what you've drawn on from history before.
Yeah. Wow, that's I suppose I'm a child of the 80s, so yeah, it's a very different experience for me. I mean, I was very fortunate in that I was from a family that kind of encouraged my creative interests and my writing, because I started as a writer, and I lived in China for a few years, which I think was sort of how I got into screenwriting. And there I guess I benefited a little bit from my, you know, being exotic, and but also I felt like in China there's a little bit more parity in a lot of different industries between men and women for various reasons I'm not going to get into now. So I think that was in my early 20s. That sort of set me up in a quite optimistic space, and I was able to quite quickly get, you know, work as a screenwriter, which is obviously very difficult to break into. And then I went to film school in New York, and I have to say that sort of optimism again took a bit of a knock, because it kind of reinforced all the stereotypes about filmmaking, like the male, it was interesting how the students would behave when we had to make projects with each other. The male students would tend to ask men to do camera and lights, but the girls could do the costumes and the makeup. So
Yep.
that was honestly, and this was like what, in the early, the 2010, I think I was at film school. So that's not that long ago, and that was very much how most of the projects were approached. And actually, you even found yourself doing it. Like my female friends and I obviously tended to try and work with each other, but sometimes it's so ingrained in you, and then you see it reinforced, that it's hard to see it for what it is. And actually, I didn't finish film school, not completely, not for that reason, but partly like that also really upset me about the whole thing. So as a director now, the way I like to work is like Caroline said, like very collaborative. And I think this idea that film sets have to be this sort of hierarchy, and the director is king and everyone should sort of bow down and they can do whatever they want and behave like brats. It's like, it's coming from a very male attitude. I have to say, no offense to men listening, but that is a very it's a particular way of thinking that I just don't think most women are conditioned to behave like that, or think that they have they don't have the self-importance, and they've not been given that opinion of themselves. And it comes back down to what you were saying, Jude, about like men having just being given a confidence in their own voice, that I just women haven't been, perhaps. I was reminded of that Rebecca Solnit sort of that essay, Men Explain Things to Me, about how men explain things and women listen. And that is, even when I was directing my debut feature film, which I wrote and directed and developed for years, a lot of it off my own back, and I produced a lot of my own short films. I've done the kind of gamut of like, indie film. You still get men popping up to tell you how, sort of give you a hand. And it's meant with, I don't think it's never meant badly, but that's how they know how to communicate oftentimes. Certainly certain generations of men. Actually, one time on set, I was working with the DOP, who was a man, a very sensitive, kind man, but he's a bit older than me. And inevitably, the person that owned the location we were in assumed that I was the assistant and that he was the director. Like, stuff like that happens all the time. But that said, we are where we are. And I have to say, the past 5 years since I made Body of Water, which went into production in 2018, it came out last year in cinemas, and now it's on demand. But it's that story is very much about a complex sort of web of women in this family. It's a small sort of almost chamber piece of a film, but it's the central character is this woman in her 30s who's actually a very successful, dynamic woman, but she's sort of flawed. Like her struggle with this anorexia is like what kind of is threatening to destroy this whole unit. And I was interested in kind of reframing this sort of the stereotype around eating disorders. That was one thing, because that's always very much associated with young girls of teenage, and I've never really seen a very satisfactory portrayal of that on screen, and it's something I knew intimately. So that was my kind of motivation there. But developing that project, I will say that I worked with Film London, who commissioned it, and they were really open to this like really complicated, like challenging story. It's not an easy film, and it doesn't offer easy answers. But sometimes there was out with our like immediate circle of execs, there was sometimes a bit of a hesitancy about like, there's a certain type of narrative around, I think particularly around women, that people are just want to steer you into because that's a safe space. And I always had to fight about certain things because that's not why I want to do this stuff. Like, I'm not someone that wants to tell safe stories. Like, that's not where I get the joy, and that's not where I want to take an audience. So that said, I think there's definitely a lot more openness to that. There's a lot of initiatives, I think, around diversity at the moment that have benefited women and minorities quite significantly in the past few years. So that's been really great to see. But until I actually see the figures of like yeah, so 50% of the women at the box, 50% of the films at the box office are directed by women, then I'll be happy. But it's still an incredibly low, like those actual figures, the bottom line figures are still really low. So it's there, but it's going to take, you know, I think maybe hopefully in like 15 years, this conversation would look very different. But I'm hopeful, but I'm like not really seeing the bottom line changes that I want.
Yeah, and I think one of the worrying things about this is that, you know, we all want to be optimistic and we all want to ride on the crest of the wave of the Me Too movement and the conversations that we've unlocked, and etc. And I certainly, from when I started WOW 12 years ago, there is an enormous and dynamic wave of conversations right across the world. You know, we do 17 different festivals in 17 different countries, and you know, it's enormously widespread, the desire for female equality and for the conversations around women and non-binary people to have not just like to have to be represented along the way that people have decided they should be represented, but just have the freedom to be anything they want and speak about anything they want. But I've also, you know, when I've had to go back and look at female creative history, just been so alarmed by all the women that were through history doing so extraordinary things, none of which I'd heard about, and all of which went away again. And that bothers me a lot. I mean, you're an assistant professor at Warwick, aren't you? Creative writing program. Yeah. So, you know, how do you sort of juggle, on the one hand, wanting gender not to be so binary? So in that case, like, write what you want, do what you want, be who you want. And on the other hand, we want to say women's stories matter and we want to place them in the middle.
Yeah. I find myself struggling with that a little bit, because my students are so of the opinion that that there's a whole conversation about gender identity ideology that's so complicated and difficult right now that I'm like, you know, it's like sort of it's very difficult waters to dip into. But my students are quite are very open and very they don't see gender in the same way as I think even I do. And I'm only like 15 or something years older than them. And I'm like, okay, so that's fine. And I can identify that. But then it does make, you know, but then sort of labeling people TERFs and things like that, I don't think that's helpful. So there's definitely, obviously the job of youth is to take a really extreme, beautiful, idealized view and like try and champion it, and then kind of, you know, mellow out as they get older, like everyone does that. But yeah, with this stuff, it is a bit of a problem when it comes to storytelling, because you're like, well, yeah, like there should be a space for women of a certain age to talk about their experiences and without being worried about being called, you know, disrespectful terms and things like that. So yeah, I don't really have an answer about that. But
yeah, I mean, I suppose I was addressing something broader really, which was that you know, I was talking to a woman in Afghanistan recently. I just done a festival called Ripples of Hope about human rights. And obviously we're talking about, you know, really terrifying situations in Afghanistan. This particular woman was saying that, you know, now all she will be expected to do is write stories as an Afghanistani woman writer about Afghanistan, about sadness, about cruelty, you know, and she actually has lots of other things she'd like to write about, you know, fairgrounds and football, for example, but you know, we'll be trapped inside this idea that women still have to represent women's stories, and in the main, those stories are kind of sad and difficult ones. Lindy, there's an interesting question from somebody called Amy in the chat room, and she wants to know that if you wanted to rewrite, Amy Sanders, if you wanted to rewrite Madame Butterfly, well, would you, and how would you rewrite it?
Look, I think this is part of the question around these pieces in opera at the moment. Do you have to completely recreate them with different outcomes or different you know, weightings of things in scenes, or do you deal with them as they are and address the problems of the works as they are? And I guess my tendency is to do that rather than rewriting. I guess what a director can do is not necessarily rewrite, be the actual writer of a work, and the composer, of course, is the key creative there. what a director can do is draw attention to things in a different way, so that the narrative is expressed differently, or seen from a different perspective, or deals with the stereotypes, or deals with the kind of the sort of accepted reading of a piece, and make it as we're just talking about, as Lucy's just said, not a safe story. I mean, there's no way that Madame Butterfly is a safe story, and there's stereotypes aplenty in Madame Butterfly. But you can, if you look at it in its roughest, if it's in its hardest, with the hard eyes on there, you do see that it's a really brutal story in which a woman is not grand, or in any way, the central woman is not grand in any way, or heroic in any way. She is just doing her best with a situation that is a very recognizable human story. So I guess that's what I'd rather do, rather than rewrite it. I think I'd rather find ways of telling those stories that are that emphasize different things and look at things a different way. So you, for example, talked about Don Giovanni and the role of women in Don Giovanni as ciphers. But I mean, when I just directed Don Giovanni, I had 200 naked women on stage dragging Don Giovanni down to hell, because one of the great famous arias of Don Giovanni is the catalogue aria, which everyone thinks is a very funny romp through 2,000 women that he's betrayed or raped or wrongly married in some way. And I just thought, let's have a small subsection of those women coming back and giving him what for at the end. I mean, that was a way of looking at it, and therefore all those other women in the piece, Elvira and Anna and Zerlina, are part of that populace of the women who are screwed over by Don Giovanni. And I think the same with Lucia. If you can point out points at which she's been abused by her brother, I mean, I think those points don't just ride through the pieces because that's the lovely aria. Really point out what's actually happening in today's parlance. That's what I would like to do.
Yeah. Are there opera pieces that you wouldn't do because you think that they are completely, unintelligent in terms of their approach?
I had thought that about Madame Butterfly. Actually, it was quite a big, deep breath to take it on. I must admit, I'm very, very pleased that I have, and I have found it. It certainly wants to go a certain way, and finding ways of wrangling it back into the world and the biosphere that Isabella Bywater and Elle Higgins and I have kind of created visually and dramatically has been something of a challenge, but really a fabulous challenge, and something that the whole company has wholeheartedly supported us in as a team of women. And I think that's been incredibly rewarding. I think you wouldn't want to take on. Look, I don't know. There's a lot of operas that have got bigger problems than even Madame Butterfly. But I think if the music has something to drag audiences through, the music is compelling, the story is compelling, the characters are compelling, the relationships are compelling. If you can make that work, then I think that's an interesting way to approach this problem of unperformable operas. Let's see if they can be performed.
Yes, I mean, I think that's what
the audience to see them differently.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great complexities, isn't it, about our canon as a whole? Who doesn't love so many films that we were brought up on, and then when you view them through the kind of idea of a gender lens, you think, oh my God.
Yeah.
And when I watch them through the eyes of my 3-year-old granddaughter or my 2-year-old grandson, I think, please not. But then I'm also watching Frozen and also saying, please not. So, and I find that very, very difficult. I mean, Caroline, how much would you like to kind of commission new stories? Because obviously you're looking at something like Madame Butterfly and looking at any of these things, and structurally the society with its oppressions is the reason for the victim ending up as they do. But there's nothing in those operas that say, and here's how we're going to change it. You know, so you can invoke from an audience pity, which a tragedy is supposed to do, and but you also have this catharsis where you kind of go, well, I've cried, I felt terrible, I've really cleansed my soul now. Good, let's go and have something to eat. So how do we move stories away from we've cried because of the oppression and the sadness, and women are really, you know, very badly off in all kinds of ways? How do we move away from that idea into give women power and actually the world's a better place? Is that interesting artistically?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's by commissioning new work, by putting those stories in a different framework, you know, changing the lens. Yes, we can reinterpret the canon as it is and give audiences a different look at it, if you like. But I think commissioning new pieces, yes, it's very expensive, but I think that's more and more now audiences will accept new pieces because, you know, and it's not just a matter of programming, you know, got to bookend it with, you know, one of the greats in the canon, but something that audiences will be challenged by as well, that that is a story that, like you say, is not necessarily female character led, but that it has that strong female story told in a different way.
And you're going to do Blaze of Glory in 2021 with WNL.
Yes.
What was just try and talk us through that one.
Okay, this again came from the Rhonda rips it up and the joy. We just kind of carried on with the same, well, the librettist Emma Jenkins, and it's a story about a Welsh mining community. There's been a pit disaster and the choir has gone, so some of the men were killed in the pit disaster, but then the old sort of musical director was cajoled into forming a glee choir by quite a strong female character. So although it started off being a role for an opera for the male chorus, it is now a completely balanced show with the male and the female chorus, and yes, some great male roles, but it's very balanced, and I think that's come because of the team. I'm director, and it began through discussions with Emma, the librettist, and myself, and developing it, and the team at Welsh National Opera as well, encouraging that along. It's stories with a community at its heart, and there is a strong woman behind the men, if you like, but it's factual, it's real, and it's embracing those strong women in the community on an equal footing with the men, if you like, but it is brand new, so therefore not safe, but it's got some fabulous tunes in it, and it's of the place as well, I think. So it's keeping the place very much at its heart, and real people. So it's not, you know, it's not gods and goddesses, and it's not fictional characters. These are real stories as well. And as I say, it's come from that collaborative process, I think, which I think women are really good at. Men are too, but speaking from my experience in the last 3 or 4 years, and the joy of being able to create something from scratch with, you know, strong female creatives, it has been joyful, and I do think it's a way to go.
I mean, I don't think we should be apologetic for trying to write a deficit. You know, that men and women recognise the fact that the world has been dominated by male concerns, male priorities, male decisions, male designs, and male sensibilities. And as you say, women have watched and learnt how to negotiate it, and then, you know an awful lot about men. I think women know more about men than men know about women, if you see what I mean, because we've done so much watching and listening. Therefore, you know, to write the deficit in order to get a more natural world, women are going to have to be in leading positions. It's not a takeover in the wrong way. It's a takeover for a good reason. So, I mean, Lucy, I get the feeling as well that women are less scared. I mean, perhaps because there's more women saying together, shoulder to shoulder, this has to change, or this is what we want. I mean, when it's just one, you know, you are a target, and you'll be ridiculed, and you'll suffer probably in your career. But now so many women are saying this, and some male allies as well. Whether it be, you know, Kate Winslet's roles, or Michaela Cole, or whatever. Does it embolden you, and does it embolden your colleagues?
Yeah, I think absolutely most of my friends in the industry, male and female, recognize that this can't be forever. It's ludicrous. And looking at my students, I think Caroline was also mentioning to you about her students, like, I do feel hope. Like, I just feel like they're just so much more confident, and this is how it's going to be for them. And I really hope that carries on, because they just seem to have a much more much more parity just in the way they think and they behave. Certainly, obviously I'm seeing a particular spectrum of society, but that gives me a lot of joy watching them work together, and it not be, oh, you know, boys do this and girls do this, etc. Because yeah, obviously that's ridiculous. So I think it's all gonna change. I'm hoping. Well, by the end of this conversation, everything will be right.
Everything will change. Everything will change.
Yeah.
So, Day of the Girl, which is the United Nations created after Malala was shot to champion girls' education, is on the 11th of October. And as we have done for the last 7 years, the WOW Women of the World Foundation will be doing a whole kind of set of projects which are working with children in need on around girls telling stories. You know, that girls are, you know, there are lots of reasons why boys need more support to find a new way out of their kind of ideas about gender. It's very confusing for boys at the moment. I get it, because we don't talk to boys very much. But girls, believe me, still are the most silenced. And depending on what part of the world they live in, it's in a brutal way. But so Day of the Girl is on the 11th of October. So anybody listening, do think about, like, how do girls tell stories, and what are girls' stories, and so on. And then the next big project I'm embarking on is called Shameless, which is a festival I'm doing in November at Battersea Arts Centre, which is called Sexual Harm and Medical Evidence. Now, you wouldn't think there'd be a good festival to be had there, would you? But I mean, I'm really always very interested in how we break through taboo, how we give ourselves the right to take things that we've been told are shameful and say, actually, this is something that we need to talk about, society needs to discuss. And also, you know, unless it's discussed, and that you can't solve it. And so we're working with academics on the medical evidence that demonstrates that any version of sexual harm, which can be just having your knickers pulled down in the playground, through to something truly horrendous that can happen, all of those things have a trauma that impacts on your future well-being and your ability to earn money. But this is another whole story. But anyway, so, you know, one way or another, we have to find ways of pulling out of sort of the dark areas, the stories that people said, oh, you don't want to hear about that, it's not very interesting, oh, that's a bit, isn't it, whatever. No, let's just tell all stories and make them all matter and all relevant. Lindy, is the production still on, the Madam Butterfly? How long is it on for?
It opens tomorrow night.
Oh my God, it opens tomorrow night. Oh, okay. So nobody listening is allowed to come to this and then not go and see it, one way or another. Okay, that's what we're up to. Okay, everybody needs to go and see it, and I hope it's a huge success, Lindy. So, and actually, it's amazing that you're here tonight.
I know, amazing, isn't it?
Same and talking.
No, I mean, just the fact that I mean, we, of course, as you know, with opera, there's always a bit of a pause between the general and the first night, so that the singers' voices can be in peak condition. But I think it's pretty amazing that I'm in Wales rather than Australia. There was like this kind of whole drama of, you know, will I get here? Won't I get here? Because it's quite hard to get out of Australia at the moment.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I'm glad that they didn't keep you in lockdown as everybody else seems to have been in there. And Adrian, I'm going to pass back to you, but it's been great talking to you, Caroline, and Lucy, and Lindy. And I'm going to find my way back down to Wales in order to go and see the production.
Right.
Thank you. Jude, well, thank you for being our marketing guru. Yes, indeed. The important thing, we do indeed open
Always
tomorrow.
artistic at heart, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Lucy, when you referred to, you know, the way of safe stories, it made me think that actually the opera industry is very, very culpable of trying to turn everything into a safe space. And one of the reasons for these discussions is really for us at WNO and our audiences and those who've attended to understand that actually so many of these stories are not safe, and we must have the courage to make them unsafe and uncomfortable. And in that way, we can reflect people's lives and the societies we live in. So for all of you, thank you so much for taking time for such an extraordinary, I felt like you could go on forever. I listened to it quite happily. And a really heartfelt thanks for giving us of your time so generously. And as Jude has pointed out, Lily's pointed out, we open tomorrow, we have performance on Sunday and 3 more the following week in Cardiff, before, of course, we go on tour to 7 different cities. So look in on the website if you're not in Cardiff. Otherwise, we look forward to welcoming you over the next week. Jude, Lindy, Caroline, Lucy, thank you so much indeed.